All right, so this is part three of the first lecture for March 11th, and we are going to pick up from talking about the tribute system and why Joseon would have participated in this, even though they had to take an inferior position within the system. So, although that was the case, they had this inferior status. It was rather costly to send these missions back and forth to the Chinese capital, but the advantages of this were that not only did this prevent the Ming Dynasty from giving them a justification to attack the Joseon Dynasty and then thus ensuring Joseon's security, but this also allowed for a certain amount of trade because, as was mentioned earlier, the borders were pretty much closed. The piracy problem was really out of control, and so it was rather dangerous to travel. There was no maritime travel. The only travel occurred over land, and it was a rather long and treacherous journey. And so the trade that did occur occurred when these embassies would be sent to the Ming capital or the Qing capital. And once they reached the capital, that also afforded other opportunities for those traveling with the embassy to trade. So that was one positive reason. The other was obviously security. And then the third is that this also allowed the Joseon dynasty to have limitless access to Chinese culture. Now, given that Confucian ideology was the state ideology at the time, and Confucian scholarship was the intellectual currency, this was a really important aspect for Joseon scholars and intellectuals to be able to access China, to be able to engage in a dialogue with Chinese scholars and intellectuals, to stay up to date with the scholarship that was emerging in China, and then they would engage in a discussion and come back, and as a result, they developed their own ideas and their own thoughts on Confucian ideology. And so during the Joseon Dynasty, there was a real prospering of Confucian scholarship. So it was for all of these reasons that the Joseon Dynasty chose to continue to participate in the tribute system. This became particularly important and beneficial for the Joseon Dynasty during the Hideyoshi invasions or the Imjin Wars. So in 1592, this is shortly after Tokugawa has unified Japan, and it's an uneasy unification. All of the daimyo, or the feudal warlords, there were some who allied with Tokugawa, and there were others who were opposed to him. And so after Tokugawa died and Hideyoshi then took over, Hideyoshi felt, well, the best way to unify all of these different groups is to have a common enemy. So he decided, let's invade China. So he had these plans to attack the Ming Dynasty. And in order to do that, he had to pass through Joseon. So he contacts Korea, says, we want to pass through. Will you let us do this? And of course, the Joseon Dynasty, being a good tribute state of the Ming Dynasty, said no. And so as a result, Hideyoshi attacked the Joseon Dynasty. The picture that you see here, this is a depiction of Hideyoshi's soldiers, and they are attacking Busan in the south. They were able to overtake Busan and then make their way up north through the peninsula. So over land, the Japanese, they experienced many victories in battle, but at sea, it was a different story. So General Yi Sun-shin, he is known for having invented this turtle boat. It's a armored boat that could um, both attack and defend. And so when the Japanese Navy then entered into Korean waters, Lee Sun-shin devised these strategies and was able to very handily defeat the Japanese Navy. There's a very famous, this was one of the major blockbuster movies in Korea. It's called Myeongnyang, and this movie was depicting General Lee Sun-shin or Admiral Lee Sun-shin and the battles, the victory in battle that the Koreans experienced. So I would suggest that you take a look at that movie if you do get a chance. It's obviously not completely historically accurate, but it will give you kind of a visual as to what was going on. But these invasions, so the first occurred in 1592, and because the Japanese just sort of rolled through Korea heading up north, the Joseon government made requests to the Ming Dynasty saying, we need help, we need military aid. And so the Ming, at first, they were not quite sure just how serious this invasion was. They sent 5,000 troops, and those were very easily defeated by the Japanese. And so later on, they sent more troops, tens of thousands of troops into Joseon. And because of this Ming military intervention and aid, they were able to stop these invasions. And so there was a stalemate, and peace negotiations were, they tried to negotiate peace, but a few years later, in 1598, Hideyoshi decided to attack again. So there was a second invasion. And the result of these two invasions was that there was really widespread death and destruction up and down the peninsula. These Japanese soldiers, they would come in and they would set things on fire. And there was also quite a bit of population movement, not just within Korea, but also to different countries. So within Korea, obviously, you have people who are trying to flee the battle areas, and they are escaping to other parts of the country. There were quite a few slaves at this time who were able to run away. So they ran away and went to different areas and basically gained freedom as a result of that. Also, there were many slave documents and slave records that were destroyed and burned during the Hideyoshi invasion. So it was although there was widespread death and destruction, there were some groups who did benefit from this war. And then you also have quite a few Koreans who were kidnapped as prisoners of war and taken back to Japan. There were many Japanese who were taken as prisoners of war and who ended up staying in Korea. There were Ming soldiers who came into Korea, ended up staying as well. So you have quite a bit of population movement at this time. And this starts to cause some instability in the country. And then shortly after, a few years after this, we have the rise of the Manchus. So the Manchus, who originally were up in this northeastern area up here, they start to consolidate, and they put pressure on both Joseon and the Ming Dynasty. They ended up attacking Joseon twice in the 1630s, and again, we have more death and destruction as a result of these Manchu invasions, but really their target was the Ming Dynasty. And so as they consolidated, They attacked the Ming Dynasty and they were able to defeat the Ming in 1644. And so once they take over, they establish the Qing Dynasty. And this dynasty was the last dynasty in Chinese history. And if you go back to the map of the Ming Empire and compare it to this map of the Qing Empire, you will notice that the Qing Empire is actually much larger. And uh, this was because the Manchus were fierce warriors. This was a very formidable dynasty. And so for the Joseon dynasty to have this large and powerful of a neighbor immediately adjacent to them here, it's intimidating, it's worrisome for the Joseon dynasty, and so they need to tread very carefully in terms of their foreign relations with the Qing. Now, it's complicated because the Joseon felt that the Manchus were barbarians. They were not civilized. They were not Confucian. And so as a result of this, they thought that the Manchus were barbarians, but at the same time, they couldn't take a completely condescending attitude because they had just defeated the Ming and they were now the most powerful entity in the region. And so, the questions then arise as to how do we establish our relations with them? Well, the Qing, the Manchus, even though they probably could have overtaken the Joseon dynasty militarily, they chose not to. And they chose instead to continue the tributary system. It had worked for the Ming Dynasty for hundreds of years, and they identified that there were quite a few benefits for them. So not only did this maintain peace and stability in the region, but also because Korea was viewed as a highly civilized and Confucian culture, that they didn't really have a justification to take it over. They knew that Korea would be a friendly state because of the tributary relations. They also understood, this is coming off of the Hideyoshi invasions or the Imjin Wars, they also understood that, although Japan could a potential military threat, Korea could act as a buffer between Japan and the Qing dynasty. And then also because of these regular missions that were sent to the Qing capital, this then afforded an opportunity for trade. So the Qing, they decided to continue this tributary system. In terms of relations with its other neighbors, so Joseon had relations with Tokugawa Japan as well as with the Jurchens to the north. And much like within the tribute system, how Joseon's relations with the Ming and the Qing were hierarchical, so were its relations with the Japanese and the Jurchens. These were also hierarchical. But in this case, Joseon took a more superior position vis-a-vis Japan and the Jurchens. So in this case, for example, with Japan, Joseon would send their envoys to Japan, and they were allowed to travel to the Japanese capital in Edo. However, the Japanese envoys, they were not allowed to travel into the interior and to the capital of Joseon, and Busan was as far as they could go. So there was, it was called the Wa House that was established in Busan, and that was as far as they could go. So you have this hierarchical relationship, and then also with the Jurchens as well. So the Joseon dynasty took a superior relationship, and the Jurchens there are records of the Jurchens paying tribute to the Joseon dynasty. So all of these relations, all of these foreign relations are hierarchical, and but this was the system that had been in place for hundreds of years, and it worked. It maintained peace and stability in the region and allowed for each country to maintain its sovereignty while trying to promote good relations between the countries. All right, so the conclusion of all of this is that during the Joseon dynasty, we have very tightly controlled borders. It's partially because it's very dangerous. It's dangerous to travel. Um, the waters, the seas are very treacherous, and to travel overland, particularly during the Ming Dynasty, when you have the Manchus and the Jurchens that are up to the north, you know, these are aggressive and hostile neighbors. So it's dangerous to travel overland to the north as well. It becomes slightly less so after the Qing consolidates their empire, and so all of that northeastern territory then becomes included within the Qing Empire, so it becomes slightly less dangerous, but still. So the Joseon dynasty, they implemented an isolationist policy. So did Tokugawa Japan. Tokugawa Japan, although they had initially been open to trade with Western countries like the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch, there was a large peasant rebellion in Kyushu. And it just so happened that also in Kyushu there is a large Christian population. And so the shogunate made the connection between Western countries, Christianity, and belligerence. And so as a result of that, they basically kicked out the Spanish and the Portuguese. They only allowed the Dutch to continue to trade because the Dutch had helped the Japanese to suppress this rebellion in Kyushu. And so they continued to trade with the Dutch, but only at one point, and that was it. And then also the Ming and the Qing, they tried to implement isolation policies as well, but because Western imperialist powers, as they made an increasing presence in the region, they really wanted to trade with China. And so it was difficult for the Chinese to keep them at bay, but they did manage to contain them to one port of trade, and that was in Canton. So we have tightly controlled borders, limited trade for the Joseon dynasty, virtually no contact with Western countries, and over a course of almost 500 years, we have very established forms of foreign relations. So please keep all of these things in mind as we go forward, and we look even more closely in upcoming lectures about how Joseon dealt with other countries, how what happened in these other countries impacted what was going on in the Joseon dynasty. So this concludes the lecture for March 11th, and I will see you on Wednesday for the next discussion. Please check Blackboard for your name as discussion leader and for it to prepare for the discussion questions.